the performance of the Marauders. Okay, so now let's look at the South African Air Force section of the presentation. The SAAF squadrons that flew the Marauder, 12 Squadron, starting in February 1944, converting off the Boston. Also 24 Squadron in January 44, also from Boston. So these were the first two squadrons to convert. And then 21 Squadron, which had flown Baltimore's. That was discussed in one of my previous presentations. And my dad's uncle flew for 21 Squadron, but he left the squadron. He was completed his tour before they were converted to Marauders. 30 Squadron, which was basically created out of the Royal Air Force Squadron 223, which was also a Baltimore squadron. So they got equipped with Marauders. The RAF personnel were withdrawn from the squadron. It was basically renamed 30 Squadron SAAF, and additional South African personnel were brought in. So it was a squadron that was created virtually at its operational base. And then there was 25 Squadron, which was actually a Ventura squadron, and they were converted quite late in the war, in November 1944, into Marauders. So there you can see in 1943, end of 43, early 44, B-26Cs, otherwise known as Marauder 2s, were supplied to 12 and 24 squadrons. So their first aircraft would have been of that type. And then a further 350 aircraft supplied in 1944, and they were used to obviously replace losses in 12 and 24 squadron, but they enabled 21 and 30 to be equipped. And then they were all ganged together to form number 3 wing, which was a part of the Desert Air Force. Now, this is a bit confusing because they were in Italy, but the old Desert Air Force from the North Africa campaign continued on in Italy and retained its name, the Desert Air Force, whereas 25 Squadron, as you can see here, was put into the Balkan Air Force. And if you remember my Beaufighter talk, 19 Squadron who flew Beaufighters were also in the Balkan Air Force, based in Italy, but they had a separate command structure, and they were used mostly to attack German forces in Yugoslavia. Anyway, these aircraft, just put a note here that they were quickly scrapped at the end of the war, and they were not returned to the United States as in terms of Lend-Lease. Okay, so let's just have a look here. I'm going to just move this. Okay, there we are. So their base of 12 Squadron, they were converted to the aircraft type at an American bombardment training center in Talergma. Talergma is on the coast of Algeria. There's still an airfield there today. It's an international airport. So that was a major sort of rear area training base. The 12 Squadron crew were taken across there, and then they flew their aircraft across Sicily to Tortorella. And they were only there for a few days because their new base was Biferno. Now, just to show you what that looks like, I've really battled to get decent maps of Italy, but there is Tortorella. If you can see my cursor over here, and Biferno was just off this map here. So this is the part of Italy we're looking at here. There was a huge complex of Allied bases in and around Foggia. So this area is sort of called Foggia. You can actually see here on this map, there's Foggia town there, and Tortorella is just outside Foggia. This is where they were based prior to the fall of Rome. The Allies were very lucky to capture this huge part of relatively level ground in Italy. Italy is a very mountainous country, as you know, so they were able to have this complex of bases. Otherwise, they would have had to do all their sorties from Sicily, and that's a fairly mountainous place as well. So this was a blessing to have all those facilities there. So initially, raids were flown across to Yugoslavia, despite being part of the Desert Air Force. Interdiction raids on the Italian mainland during Operation Strangle. This was now with the Gothic line, where they German interdiction to stop supplies and ammunition and things to be transported to the German forces. And then after the fall of Rome, they were harassed. German forces harassed, falling back to their next line of defense. I also made a note here about Biferno. It was near a town called Campo Marino, which was, as I said, just off that map. There we go. It was just off here. The base was right on the beach, and today it's actually doesn't exist because the coastline has been eroded by the rising waters of the Adriatic Sea, and so that base can't actually be found anymore. This is a picture I found of Tortorella, showing the runway and some of the dispersal, and obviously they had a perimeter fence around here to keep locals out there. I'm just having a problem with my notes here, but anyway. All right, so we've seen that. The Foggia complex, Tortorella. Okay, now April 1944, they had a bad incident where a bomb was being fused in the dispersal area, and for some reason or other, it went off, and it caused a huge amount of damage. You can see here this is that PSP planking, which was used for the runway and the dispersal areas to give it some sort of hard surface. And luckily, the 500-pound bombs nearby did not explode, but a huge amount of fuel was lost. I believe the pilot was on board when this happened. He was killed, and a lot of ground crew as well, and people injured. So a bit of a bad incident. There was a softball game in progress, which obviously had to be abandoned, and all hands to try and put out the fire and stop it spreading to the bomb dump. This is the sort of typical raid the 12th Squadron would be involved in, bombs exploding in Ancona Harbour. It was a major rail and supply network for the Germans on the Adriatic coast, and you can see 12th Squadron aircraft attacking Ancona. Nearby was an ammunition dump, which had been seen, and so a raid was organized against that. And on the left-hand side, you can see the bombs going off, and doesn't seem to be doing terribly much damage. And then one aircraft threw its bomb slightly skew, and there was this massive explosion that you can see on the right-hand side here. So the bombs actually landed in a cemetery, and then they realized the Germans were putting up dummy ammunition dumps, which were being seen by air reconnaissance, but their real ammunition was being concealed in the cemetery. And so with the result, a large number of cemeteries were bombed to try and take out the Germans' ammunition dumps. Here was another typical raid. Bridges. A lot of the campaign in Italy was fought against bridges, to prevent Germans retreating or prevent them from getting supplies to one of their lines. So quite a dramatic shot there. This looks like some good bombs here down on the bottom part of the picture. A bridge is a very difficult target to hit, and they were often well defended with flak. So this would have been a typical type of raid. So the Gothic line was obviously north of Rome. The Gustav line was the line south of Rome. So with that, they could leave the Foggia area, and they moved up the coast to Pescara. There was some dramatic footage of a bomb run on a junction just south of Florence, and this Lieutenant Webb's aircraft just exploded as they were releasing the bombs, but it damaged the nose of the commanding officer's aircraft, which was literally ripped off, and Colonel Barnby and his crew basically spiraled into the ground. Two other aircraft in the same box of four were also badly damaged and basically crash landed back at the base. So there was an investigation into this. I'll get back to that later, but pretty dramatic scenes. I think I've got a picture of it. There it is there. That was the photograph of the aircraft. I mean, here you can see on the right-hand side of the left picture, there's the fuselage and tail upside down, and that's the wing that's basically blown off, and the fuel burning. There you can see the engine, and this is a sort of close-up taken later of the wing, just torching through the sky. So a great tragedy there. Apparently, they had an inquiry into this, and Cecil Margot, who later became Justice Margot and did some inquiries, including the Helderberg inquiry, he was brought in to find out what the cause was, and they suspect that it could have been two 500-pound bombs, which were RAF ordnance, that collided after being dropped and during their fall, and they collided and blew up. And apparently the SAAF then changed to 1,000-pound American fused bombs after they'd worked this out. So if you take this plus the bomb that went off on the ground earlier that year, it seems that there must have been a fusing problem with the British ordnance, and that was then changed. This was the next move. They moved to a place called Jesi, which is in Italian Iesi, and it was supposed to have been a field with a lot more, a lot better facilities. They call them all-weather runways. Well, wasn't really that much all-weather. It had prefabricated Hessian surface known as PHS. It was made of an asphalt impregnated jute fiber, which was rolled out over the compacted surface of square mesh track and a grid of wire. It was just a grid of wire joined in 3-inch squares. Today, this airfield is undetermined because it's completely taken over by agriculture, and there's no evidence of this field anymore. But it was a major base near this town of Jesi or Iesi, and a lot of squadrons were based there. So despite that, a lot of rain. Italy was had particularly wet summers and very cold winters during the 1944-45 period, and so this certainly hampered operations. There you can see a picture at Jesi, water pooled up here, fuel drums strewn about, a real difficult time to live and to also service aeroplanes under those sort of conditions. Here's a shot of 12th Squadron in late 1944, flying an unusually tight formation. This is the sort of formation you would fly if there would be some fighters around, but by the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was pretty much absent from the scene there, and so it's the main losses were due to flak. And if you look at the Italian campaign, I don't find one reference to a Marauder being shot down by a German fighter or Italian fighters fighting on the German side. All the losses, the operational losses, were flak, and then there were obviously accidents and engine failures, and then the sort of accidents we saw with bombs going off, which we're not supposed to. So the color scheme of these aircraft is pretty much the same as the American. So they were supplied in the American olive drab, and with the American this neutral light gray that they had on the undersides. Some of the aircraft you can actually see they painted the sides of the fuselage in a fresher or darker coat of olive drab, possibly to paint out the American markings prior to the application of SAAF markings and serial numbers. There's another shot of an aircraft from 12 Squadron. Apparently, it's a bit unusual to have the squadron badge on the tail. They normally put it on the nose somewhere. And if you look here on the trailing edges of the wings, there's this looks like quite a lot of mud and wear and tear on the wings, possibly because of ground crew climbing up on the wing to refuel it and possibly to work on the engines. And you know, you saw the terrible conditions, the muddy conditions they had to work under, and you know, there wasn't time to wash the mud off the wings. So these aircraft really took a hammering, and for the modelers, if you're doing a model of this period of the war, weathering is going to be quite important in your modeling exercise. So right through to 1945, when the weather allowed, from up till about February, there was very little good weather to fly raids. One of the new targets in 45 was these sugar refineries in Cermide and Pontelungo in late February when the weather allowed. The reason for this was that they were making alcohol from the sugar, and alcohol could be used as a substitute fuel, and I guess also in explosives. A lot of the ingredients of explosives ammunition is alcohol distillates. So these formed a viable target for the Desert Air Force to attack. Most of the attacks were done as a wing, and so you would find all the squadrons of the wing providing aircraft for each raid. So there's a great deal of overlap in the operational record. Fighter escorts were sometimes available, but as I said, the Luftwaffe was pretty much out of the picture at that stage. So unless they knew they were going into a defended area, possibly more so in northern Italy than in central Italy, and particularly here, this raid in April 1945, they attacked a railway marshalling yard in Austria, a place called St. Veit, and that would have been defended by German fighters. So having some fighter cover, also P-47s operated in Italy and would be available. And then the squadron at the end, the Germans surrendered on the 29th of April, and the squadron moved to Udine, which is right up in the north of Italy near Trieste, northeast. And they then ferried troops to Bari for repatriation back to South Africa. Not really a good troop-carrying airplane, but anyway, I suppose it was better than going by rail or by ship. Guys wanted to get home after the war, and so this was one way of getting the guys to an embarkation port quickly. The squadron was disbanded in 1945. It had been in service in action for 5 years continuously, right from the East African campaign. We've now just touched on the Marauder phase of the squadron's record, and which took it to the end of the war. Now here's some nose art from 12 Squadron, which I included in my slides. The one at the top there was Kilo, which was called Class Haas, and here's D Delta, which has got a Donald Duck. So the guys at 12 Squadron were quite keen on their nose art, and this is where Graham Lloyd contacted me via Carl. He's the nephew of John Lloyd. We mentioned him earlier, and he said to leave us to go and sleep for his next flight tomorrow. His great uncle on his grandmother's side was Lieutenant Cedric Dutton, who was killed in action when his Marauder Class Haas was shot down just south of Ancona Port. So I got this email, and coincidentally I'd already made up that slide, so there's a coincidence for you. He says, I'm in contact with a few of the crew's family and also managed to contact the son of the only survivor of the shoot down. He unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, but he was very helpful in giving me a lot of info and maps that his father drew. This assisted me when I went to Ancona to the graveyard and the area where the aircraft came down. So, and then he also sent me these two pictures about the Maytag Marauder. I managed to find out what this was all about. Maytag is an American washing machine, and they make washing machines and similar household appliances. And the Maytag company had clubbed together in order to purchase this Marauder. The employees had clubbed together to purchase this Marauder, and there's a picture of the handover ceremony. And this aircraft ended up being supplied to 12 Squadron. And Graham writes about his great uncle, who also had the misfortune of having to ditch a brand new Marauder off the east coast of Italy, the Maytag Marauder, which was paid for by the employees of the Maytag factory in the USA. And this on the right, it's not that clear, but this is the accident report on the loss of the aircraft, and written in typical military style, listing the serial numbers of the engines and whatever, and the crew members, and some were seriously injured and the rest lightly injured. Unfortunately, no fatalities, but it says here, starboard engine cutting and propeller running away alternately, forced pilot to ditch the aircraft. So there, once again, we see the bold bugbear of the electric propellers running away, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and possibly a malfunction from the factory, and it crept in, and this was happening, and Lieutenant Dutton had no recourse but to ditch the aircraft. So that is 12 Squadron. I'll just put them consecutively now. 21 Squadron was one of the later squadrons to convert, July 1944, and they were pressed into service immediately because the offensive against the Gothic line was in progress, and they were operating from Campo Marino, which could be a synonym for Biferno, because it was basically located on the beach at Campo Marino. So based at Pescara, that was now after the Gothic line fell. They also had a bomb going off while being fused on the ground, which killed a pilot and several ground personnel. I might actually have a pic of that as well. Just give me a sec. 2 pics down there. That was the Marauder that was blown apart by that bomb explosion. So another unfortunate incident which cost some lives. They had various successes against Forley marshalling yards, and less so against a bridge in Ravenna. They were not that familiar with this new bomb site. They had come off Baltimore's, as mentioned earlier, and this site was a lot more sophisticated. But as I said, with practice and experience came better results. Jersey, with those wet and miserable conditions, there was an unfortunate incident with a B-24 landing and skidding off the runway and destroying some aircraft in the dispersal at 12 Squadron. Again, as I mentioned, they were part of the 3-wing Desert Air Force, and they attacked a lot of targets up in the northeast of Italy as a wing, and with the negative weather factors in late 1944 and early 1945. Here's a shot of the squadron commander's aircraft. He was Lieutenant Colonel Jandrell, and taken in the picture is Lieutenant Mayer on the left, who was apparently responsible for much of the nose art, and with the air mechanic Slubbert, which is on his left, probably a bit of an artist himself. And so the Yankee was the call sign, and it had this lion and flag device. If you look carefully, you'll see here that there's one of the package guns on the side of the fuselage, and the one above it has been removed. Apparently, the SAAF decided that this extra weight of the gun, the upper guns, wasn't worth it, and so they were often removed. There was not a lot of fighter opposition. They didn't go down low level and strafe, so just the pair of the lower guns would be sufficient for defense. That was the bomb explosion in 1945. Again, railway bridges and such were recurring targets. Finally managed to drop the bridge in March. Again, the sugar refineries, oil storage facilities were attacked. In April, the last offensive to take the Po Valley and the Venetian Plain, this Argenta Gap, was a strategic choke point which the Germans were defending to allow their armies to escape across the Po Valley. So they were used in close support to allow the 8th Army to force the gap and get the Germans on the run. And meanwhile, there were marshalling yards which were bombed to trap the Germans, particularly towards the north of Italy and the Brenner Pass. They were able to bomb those passes and prevent the Germans from getting away. The Germans capitulated on the 29th of April. A month later, they did their victory flypast at Campo Formido, and that was the end of the squadron. It disbanded, 21 Squadron. There's a pic of going over the Alps, that raid at St. Veit. here's an aircraft. This is A Alpha, which was eventually lost in a raid on the Arsa Channel. Canals and things like that were also strategic points to hit to prevent supplies being brought up. Apparently, 4 of the crew made it back to Allied lines with the aid of partisans. So, right, 24 Squadron. They also a Boston Squadron. They were at Tortorella at the time, and the aircraft were being supplied piecemeal. But because they were part of the Desert Air Force, they decided they would be needed for operations back in Libya. So they moved back to Gambit, an airfield in Libya, and they were tasked for operations in the Aegean. So the Germans had a lot of shipping in the area around Greece and Crete. So they attacked Suda Bay, which is where the Allies evacuated from when the German paratroopers invaded Crete 3 years previously. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robbs, was shot down by flak. There's an amazing picture, which I'm going to show you now, of his aircraft after it was hit. And the story is, if you look very carefully at this aircraft, it looks like everything is normal, but the tail has actually broken off here. And it's severed by the flak. It's turned around and it's actually upside down with the fin down, and the machine guns of the tail gunner are facing forward. And it's actually about 100 feet higher than the rest of the aircraft. So it's just a fluke shot taken by one of the other aircraft. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Robb and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Townsend, were the only survivors. They managed to open the hatches that I showed you in the previous pictures above the pilot's seats. They opened those cockpit hatches and they were able to bail out through the top of this wildly spinning aircraft. But any of the other crew that remained in the aircraft were not able to bail out because of the rotational forces. The aircraft spun into the ground. Then they started getting quite a lot of fighter opposition in the Aegean here over Rhodes Harbour. Some ME-109s attacked them, and one was claimed shot down. So this squadron seems to be the only squadron that lost aircraft marauders to fighter action, and particularly in the Aegean. Another raid to Portolago was more vigorously attacked by more fighters. Some were claimed shot down, as you see there. And this Focke-Wulf tried a head-on attack on a marauder, and as I said, there's 5 machine guns facing him, and I don't think he realized that was just not the way to do it. So he got himself shot down. One marauder was lost, and another on a subsequent sortie. So the Germans were looking at these marauders and saying, this is a different sort of beast to attack. So they started changing their tactics. And there's a nice shot of a tight box formation over the Aegean Sea, which seemed to be their main task. This is G. George of 24 Squadron, and it's still got the US Air Force serial number on the tail, so it's just been delivered. Yeah, some more shots of S for sugar, the old alphabet, with the olive drab color and the neutral gray underneath, which were the standard US Air Force delivery colors. So then came the famous Marauder Massacre on the 6th of March 1944. Was a raid on Scala Bay on Santorini Island. There were 6 aircraft that were unescorted because of the distance they had to fly, led by Captain Shuttleworth and Bell and Braithwaite in 2 and 3, and Friedrich was the second Vic of 3 with Doveton and Bowles. And the fighters began a coordinated attack that lasted for 90 minutes. So not only were there more aircraft now, that they were operating in groups, doing coordinated attacks from different directions in a coordinated manner, and pressing home the attacks determinedly. So they singled out Marauder E, flown by Doveton, which was badly damaged, dropped out of the formation. They managed to crash land at Oran on the Turkish coast, but that was not known until the war was over. They were interned there. And then they picked on Marauder V, which was piloted by Bowles, and was shot down into the sea. Then concentrated on the leader of the second echelon, Captain Frolick's aircraft, and he pulled up under the formation with smoke streaming from his aircraft. The undercarriage came out and it started in a spin. 4 parachutes were seen to open. All members of the crew were actually killed. In a matter of minutes, the second flight had been totally wiped out. So the lead flight was fought on until the target was reached, where the fighters gave them temporary respite until they'd gone through the flak area on their bombing run. The ships were there all right. The flak was medium but inaccurate, so a long run up on the target was possible, but the bombs overshot by about 400 yards. So obviously a little bit rattled on the bomb run. And as soon as they turned off target, the remaining fighters renewed attacks, and the 4th Marauder W was lost at 1429, hit in the starboard engine, which caught fire, also plummeted into the sea after losing its starboard wing. And the fire reached the cockpit. The tail gunner of the leading aircraft wept as he saw George Bell go down, and he sat behind his jammed and useless guns. They had problems with the rear machine guns. It's very unusual that a Browning 50 would jam, but whatever was causing these jams, it was probably the feed, the ammunition feed, and possibly cold conditions or incorrect oil, whatever the case may be. They were literally becoming defenseless as the trip continued. So that's why they were not really in a position to defend themselves. Some, of course, the remaining guns were out of ammunition, and so that was a huge loss for the squadron. Having 4 aircraft lost was, including flight leader, was a serious blow, and so they grounded the squadron and reformed and retrained replacement crews for this. So this was towards the end of the operations in the Aegean. The next run they did on Porto Lago, they decided they would have to be escorted by Spitfires from 41 Squadron and 94 Squadron RAF. So they staged across to Nicosia in Cyprus, and then refueled, the fighters refueled, and then they continued the sortie from there. So that was a little bit safer, because at least now they had a fighter escort to attack the shipping. One of the ships they were particularly keen on sinking was this Gerda Top, which they hit in April, but it remained afloat. Then they tried nighttime raids against Malem airfield in Crete. That was where the German paratroopers had landed back in 1941. The runway was damaged, and they managed to set ablaze the petrol dump. By this stage, Lieutenant Colonel Margot, whom we met earlier, was the squadron commander, and he led 60 Marauders, Baltimores, and Beaufighters in a huge gaggle to intercept a convoy near Heraklion, which is in Greece. And the Gerda Toft was one of the ships in that convoy. So they had quite a bit of success on that raid, sinking 2 merchant ships, a destroyer and 2 small escort vessels, damaging a cruiser and a merchantman. The remainder of the convoy limped into Heraklion, where they were set upon repeatedly in the next few days. So this naval action was known as the glorious 1st of June in the squadron legend, which referred to the 4th Battle of Ushant, which was conflict between the UK or Great Britain and the French Republic during the French Revolutionary Wars, where a large amount of French ships were sunk at Ushant. So that was the 1st of June. Then the squadron returned.
John, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, sure. Now we are out of time again. So it's now about 9:47, so about 2 minutes to 10, please. Everybody back, and we continue. Thank you, John.
Okay.